Okay, thank you, Vincent. Thank you, everyone, for being here in this less than ideal weather. It's also good to hear that you already know what I'm going to say. We'll see if I will say what you think I'm going to say. Yes, I will share my presentation that I have. Right, I think everybody can see it. Yes, great. And it's full screen, yes. Okay, great. As most of you probably already know, if you have looked at it before, the title of my talk today is What is Speculative Philosophy of History and what is it good for? So in a sense, it's a double question. On one level, I am supposed, I guess, to tell you what speculative philosophy of history is. And the second part, what is it good for, if anything? And answer beforehand, I think it is good for something. And I think there's also some way to define speculative philosophy of history, maybe coherently or at least cogently. Right, so let's see. Now, as an overview, what am I going to talk to you today? Well, first, I will give you a list of speculators. Basically, everybody and their relative has been called a speculative philosopher of history before. That being the case, it might not be a very useful concept, or it might still be. Maybe they were all speculators in a very sort of meaningful way. Then I will give you what I think is a good definition of speculative philosophy of history and the criticism of speculative philosophy that has been coming from analytical philosophy of history, basically the philosophy of history from the 1950s to 1970s. I still think that criticism is mostly correct, though it has been phrased in a bit in a bit too strident way, and the meta philosophy on which I will come to that. The meta philosophy on which the analytical philosophy of history is based is flawed. Then I will say, if we take the criticism of speculative philosophy of history into account as pursued by the analytic philosophers of history, then there are two main topics that are salvageable, that we want to talk about. We want to talk about what speculative philosophy of history has tried to talk about, which is social ontology and grand scope social or historical theories. So theories with a grand scope to explain the past or explain the social. Now, after that, I will shortly talk about maybe speculative philosophy, despite of it all and despite of the criticism that has been voiced against it, is an important past in our, what has been called relations to the past, not in this country, but in the adjacent neighboring country. Hermann Power, maybe some of you know him, a famous historian and theoretician of history, has brought up the term relations to the past, that people relate to the past in a very different way. And it's not necessarily a condition of relating to the past that we relate to the past in epistemically justified ways. So maybe speculative philosophy of history is here to stay on an everyday level because we can't get rid of it, perhaps. And then I will give you a conclusion about what I think from the standpoint of modern philosophy of historiography, what's up with speculative philosophy of history. And I hope I should be done in 45 minutes. This was the time that I was given. Now, I told you I will start with a list of the people who have been called speculative philosopher of history. And this obviously is an incomplete list. Probably many more people have been called that. And I've tried to be as wide as I can to name some people here that people here have interest in. I'm sure many of you in this room are specialists or interested in some of these and will have objections to, but these are the people that not I am having made speculative philosophers, but somebody has. So among the philosophers, we have such, and I think I ordered them roughly chronologically. We have thinkers such as Vico, Herder, Turgot, Condorcet, Voltaire. So basically, the French Enlightenment thinkers and some romanticists before, outliers before. Kant, Fichte, Hegel, Marx, the German tradition. Comte, sort of famous founder of positivism. Then this I put here for the Leuven, Husserl. He has been called a speculative philosopher of history with his 1935 or 1940s and later, this crisis, the crisis of European culture, whatever it's called, you know it very well. Jan Patočka, another famous phenomenologist, who built on here, Hegel. Husserl, he has been called a speculative philosopher of history. But it's not just the German and French and the continental thinkers. Even John Stuart Mill, Karl Popper, who's supposedly something else, and Thomas Kuhn have been called speculative philosopher of histories for their understanding of science. They supposedly have not done a speculative philosophy of history as a whole, but a speculative philosophy of the history of science. Then among the historians, the supposed founder of scientific historiography, Ranke, has been called a speculative philosopher of history, and he had some speculative philosophers later in his life. Burckhardt, Spengler, calling him a historian is might be a bit doubtful. Toynbee, these people have all been called speculative philosophers, but also maybe some of you know that a big history is a big thing. It's supported by Bill Gates. It's supposed to tell the history of everything from the Big Bang to our current period and beyond. This is very closely linked to a historian called David Christian. He's very famous. He has been called a speculative philosopher of history for his take on the whole of history and beyond. But also people such as Yuval Harari with what's called Deus Ex and this sort of stuff. Then, of course, the theological thinkers, which might also be philosophers. Bossuet is very famous, Augustine of Hippo, St. Augustine. Some people call him the founder of speculative philosophy of history, at least in the Western sense. The biblical prophets, which did some sort of prophecy and philosophy of history. And other people that I'm not going to put into any categories. So Francis Fukuyama is very famous for his thesis about the end of history. I read once a book by Michel Houellebecq, I think it was Elementary Particles. In there, he has an understanding of history that what I will give you later could be called speculative philosophy of history. And then, of course, what I said before, many ordinary people and their understanding of the past has been called speculative. Now, given that, if such a distinguished list of thinkers are speculative, and they are be found in philosophy, they are found in literature, they're found in politics, theology, in philosophy, the question is then, what, if anything, is speculative philosophy of history? And if something is wrong with it, what's wrong with it? And can we rid ourselves of it if this is sort of the pedigree of it and the understanding? Now I'll give you a very roughly hewn introduction to speculative philosophy, and then I'm going into a bit more detail. But the term speculative philosophy of history particularly came up in discussion roughly between 1940 or the beginning of 1950s and 1970s in the philosophy of history. And it came up as a distinction between speculative philosophy of one hand and critical philosophy of history. I thought it's a Kantian distinction originally, speculative and critical, but it was made popular for the question of history and historiography by such thinkers as William Walsh, I forgot the first name of Dre, and Patrick Gardiner. But there are also similar distinctions that have been made, for instance, substantive versus analytical, which is Arthur Danto. He's a famous philosopher, not so much for his work on history, but otherwise. Or material versus formal philosophy of history, which Maurice Mandelbaum made. But the main term basically nowadays is speculative versus usually nowadays analytical, but also critical. Other terms that have been closely connected to philosophy of speculative philosophy of history are terms like universal history, philosophical history, and there are other terms in other languages. Somebody once told me in French they call it histoire raisonnée. Never heard the term before, but it might very well be. Now, there's an interesting conceptual question here, distinction, because probably most of you know the original meaning of the term speculation is observation. It's a translation of the Greek term theoria, and of course, well, here interestingly, the German word Spiegel and the Dutch word Speichel, mirror, comes from the same root as the word speculation, and one means reflection. We all know what a mirror is for. So already before the 1940s, when this term came up in the philosophy of history, there was a radical meaning change to a negative term for speculative philosophy. And also in the philosophy of history in particular, it's a polemical term. So it's a term of distinction for what is not to be done. It is as much descriptive as it has other uses. One of them sort of to dissuade people from doing philosophy in a certain way without critically arguing for it, I suppose. Now, what is sort of, if I give an overview, what is the main understanding of what speculative philosophy of history is? Well, as Patrick Gardiner put it, it's supposed to give an all-embracing interpretation of the historical process. So supposedly we can say something meaningful, and meaningful is a very important word here, I will come back to that, about history from the beginning of humankind at least, perhaps even longer, until now, and often also supposedly about the future. And it's a coherent account, including the future. Yes, so supposedly we can say something, given that we know the structure of history, perhaps, or the motor of history, or the main principle of history, we can meaningfully also speak about the future. And obviously, not every statement about the future is a problem. We make predictions all the time, and they're well crafted. They're sort of epistemically licit. The question is sort of, so supposedly speculative philosophy of history must speak about the future in a way that is illicit or problematic. And usually this has been phrased by the critics as that the speculative philosophers are after the meaning of history with capital M. So sort of what does it all mean? Being in history, being human, being in the historical process. And that was related to the meaning and the significance of a whole, because of the whole of history. Because obviously, in one understanding of meaning, we find something meaningful because we relate it to a whole. Like if you read a novel and you read something is happening in there, we understand what's the meaning of this, what's the significance of it when we know what the story is about. And the argument then, if you give it shortly, sort of, we need to know what the whole of history is about so as to be able to make a speculative philosophy of history. And presumably that is impossible. But so in a sense, speculative philosophy is a fundamentally metaphysical endeavor, and I'm saying this here without any evaluation. So it's about what is history and what's its point. So you could also call it sort of ontological about history, if this is the more neutral term nowadays. Therefore, it's also the moniker special substantive philosophy of history. So what is not necessarily what's the substance of history, but what is the driving force or the main principle of history. Now, this is a bit small, I'm sorry, but maybe here it works. So what exactly has speculative philosophy then been called, or what are the characteristics of speculative philosophy? Well, it has been said that speculative philosophy of history is either after the pattern, the principle, or the purpose of history, or perhaps all three of them. And then it's of course a question whether it needs to meet one or more of those criteria so as to be count properly speculative. We can discuss that. So the pattern of history basically is how history is unfolding. The mechanism is what does the unfolding, if you like, and the goal is the end, which gives everything a meaning. And of course, this meaning doesn't need to be in the future. I mean, there have been philosophers, speculative philosophers of history, which said history has already ended. Maybe it ended. I mean, in a very perhaps superficial interpretation of Hegel, as it ended with the Russian monarchy of his time. So everything else is what the French might call post-histoire, or something that's not history anymore. Maybe it's something else. Now, if we talk about the pattern, a very sort of famous pattern that history is supposed to have is cyclical. I mean, with the ancient Greeks and Romans, you have this understanding. Perhaps you analogize the history with the ages of a human from childhood to later on, or you have sort of a golden age and some silver, bronze, and so forth. That comes back from, or a civilization rises and it has to fall. Very famous. I forgot his first name. Spengler's theory of the organic civilizations, how they develop and necessarily decay, has become cyclical, and that goes on in history. But you can also have sort of a linear understanding. The pattern of history is linear, and linear can be regressive or progressive. So not very common nowadays, but you could say everything was the golden age was in the beginning, and it all went downhill from there to wherever, to what end, to an end maybe. Or it can be progressive, like in Comte or in some forms of Marx, where you have sort of linear progress towards then communism. It can be a combination of these two, spiral. So there's a linearity, but it goes upward. Some people say Vico has had that, but I'm not an expert and it has been criticized. Or you can make sort of any pattern. It can be chaotic. You could even say it's God or an evil demon's unfathomable pattern, but it's still a pattern there, or at least you believe in it. Now, as the main principle of history, there have been many things also connected to this. For instance, in the understanding in Marx linear, or the Marx of historical materialism, linear understanding of history, it's class struggle that pushes forward history from beginning to end. In somebody like Augustine of Hippo, with it's divine providence that guides everything. In David Christian, it's complexification. So we have the thresholds of complexity, and history is becoming more and more complex with the future. We can have all kinds of principal dialectical movements, an unfolding of nature or reason, which might be dialectical, or other forms of philosophy of history. And the purpose and the end of goal of history has been named for instance, a big cross here in the room, so it might be appropriate to talk about this, or maybe not. Maybe I will be judged. But for instance, in the Christian doctrine, the goal of history is the parousia, the second coming of Christ, and then the last judgment, whether or not there's 1,000 years in between, which gives the whole meaning to the historical process. And then with Marx, it's communism. And of course, this end of history, or the purpose, it can be a telos and or a finis, or both. So a finis is the end, and the telos is just a goal. So as if it's just a goal, then something else goes on. If it's the actual finis, the actual end of the world, then it's an eschatology. So then everything will end. The good people might go to heaven and the others go elsewhere. Now, formally, this understanding of speculative philosophy history has also been connected to sort of the requirement to give a single interconnected story of everything that existed with a unified subject. So it follows from the other principles in a sense. If there's an overarching pattern to history or one mechanism that makes history going and a purpose, then it should be possible to describe it as one narrative, as one single story. And basically the Bible narrative or of the other Abrahamic religions, this is one story that is the history of the world, and all other happenings in the world have to be related to that to be meaningful. And usually you cannot do that, so it's all botched. Or it's kind of if you look at that, it's yes. So if you then think about it, what makes speculative philosophy sort of, I'm not sure if illicit is the right way, but makes special is to sort of that is built on the claim to know the whole of history, and by the whole of history, at least in principle, the principles and the progression, the whole of history here includes the future. And again, as I just said before, it's not the claim itself to know the future that is the problem, because we have predictions. We might even have predictions in history. It's a bit doubtful. Or at least we have real predictions. But it's a way of foreknowing or prophesizing the future that can be done, at least in the criticism of those people. So and given that you know the end of history, the purpose, the goal, this gives many speculative philosophy of history their prophetic or apocalyptic character. Obviously, the prophet knows it, the prophet proselytizes it out. But of course, you're usually even a better prophet, and you might even get more following if you're apocalyptic, if the end is near. So that is. So given this structure, many people have said, not many people have said, but Karl Löwit has said, who is very famous in this discussion, and many people have been following Karl Löwit in that respect, that basically speculative philosophy of history is essentially a theological structure of history, and this prototype is the Bible, the Jewish and Christian story of the revelation of God and God's plan and providence, and the story we have in the Bible, which ends with the parousia and then the last judgment. And that this kind of structure, this understanding of history has been secularized as forms of progressivism, which then like Marxism, progressivism, something like the Enlightenment thinkers and the understanding of rationality and reason, but of course, as with Marxism. And many critics then also allude or say that speculative philosophy of history basically has whatever it says about history, its basic purpose is moral or political. You can call it something like in the form of ideology critique. It gives perhaps moral consolation, uplift, satisfaction, and of course, if you believe in it, it might also give you the key to history or to further political action, which has also been criticized. I come back to that. Because there's a tension here. If we know the principle of history and the goal of history, then it's at least doubtful what human agency can do, unless the goal is somehow related. I mean, unless you're somehow determined by that and how that will work. How that is, how it goes together with any form of proper human agency is questionable sometimes. Okay, now we come more centrally to the criticism. I mean, I've summarized the criticism of speculative philosophy of history as per the analytic philosophy of history of the 1950s, 1970s, roughly. The criticism is basically epistemological. It's metaphysical or anti-metaphysical, because for those thinkers, you could not really do metaphysics. So it's in a sense metaphilosophical. What they do looks like philosophy, but it's not proper philosophy. It's logical and it's moral. And the background here is not going to go into that, but basically the model by which these people understood philosophy of history was set by Carl Gustav Hempel. I recently learned his friends called him Peter Hempel, and his covering law model and his understanding of what's the proper goal of what's the proper task of philosophy in analyzing concept and logical relations of concept, that sort of stuff. And the main protagonists of the debate that pushed forward this understanding of speculative philosophy of history were named Georg Gangl, Walsh, Morton White, Galley, Danto. But there were also always a faction of dissenters, and I'm just mentioning them here. They are not known nowadays very well. Rolf Gruner, Peter Muntz. Some people might know him. He was big close associate of Karl Popper, and Haskell Fane, but they are mostly forgotten, and that tells you that one understanding of speculative philosophy of history has at least won out. So what is the criticism epistemically? What is the epistemic problem with speculative philosophy of history? Well, the question is, how do those people know about the past? I mean, that's basically what epistemology is about. So they are, I mean, you could phrase it the other way around. Or that's at least my position, and it's contentious perhaps. The only way we have to get warranted and reliable knowledge of the past is historiography and its methods. So if you take that route, the question is, which kind of access does the speculative philosophy of history, maybe a prophet, have to the past and the future that makes it possible for them to give us epistemically justified statements of the past? Then there's a logical problem to which I come to describe the past by the future. But basically, of course, the understanding then is, or the question is, there's a lot of meanings in history, as it was phrased in that debate. People did something for certain reasons. That's the meaning of an action. Maybe you can explain things causally. That's one understanding of meaning too. You can put something in a bigger framework. The philosophy of history calls it colligation, that you put something in something like. That's a form of meanings that are history, but it's not the meaning of history. And if you want to have the meaning of the history, then you have the epistemic question of how you get to it. Now, another criticism was the metaphysical or anti-metaphysical point. One is about the actual entities that were being constructed by this, or by many speculative philosophers of history. I don't know. What is capital R reason? What is some supposed Volksgeist, the spirit of a people? These are metaphysically rather loaded terms themselves, so you can question that. I mean, these people were mostly methodological individualists. So at least so in that sense, maybe they were ontological individualists too, but social ontology. So there wasn't drive to reduce those concepts. But more stinging criticism might be is the parallelization with philosophy of science. So what the philosopher does, I mean, the philosopher of science, it doesn't have direct access to nature. So what they do is philosophy of science. So the philosophy of historiography, the philosophy of history should see what historians are doing instead of looking at history by itself. And just as the philosophy of nature nowadays doesn't exist nearly anymore, maybe it does, but not as much as it does. Their belief was philosophy of history. For history shouldn't exist in that form anymore because the only access we have is via historiography. So this was usually phrased as focus on the logic of historical thinking instead of the structure of history. And maybe the structure of history comes out of the logic of historical thinking anyway. So, and otherwise, if you do philosophy of nature proper, philosophy of history proper, you end up either with the summaries of scientific results, which is a worthwhile task, but maybe scientists can do that better, or you have idle fantasies of the imagination. That's William Walsh. Then sort of the logical point, and I'm sure logical is exactly the right word here, is that speculative philosophy of history wants to give an account of the past based on a very specific account of the future. And that is the whole of the future, because otherwise you couldn't give the meaning of history as a whole, because we are all in. So as to give the meaning of history, you either history need to have ended, or you need to be outside of history. I mean, so God is supposedly outside of history, therefore God can tell us what history is. And also they are also supposedly omniscient, so they can do that too. But the main point here is, or at least Danto argued, that historical descriptions of things, which give us the description of the significance or meaning of a historical event, can only be given after the later event has happened. So historiography, in many senses, is about hindsight. It's maybe a bit counterintuitive to some people, but historiography, at least in one of its main perspectives, is not to see the past as the historical actors have seen it themselves. Because under epistemically good conditions, the historian has not just access to the historical actors and what they thought, but also what happened after them. So they have the virtue of hindsight. So they can describe the past for instance, by its causal consequences and so forth, which most historical actors cannot know at one level at least. So historians legitimately describe the past by means of its significance and meaning on that level. But it's not the meaning of the whole of history, and that's logically impossible. For that, we will need to be outside of history, or history would have ended. And we can give a short example here. So, for instance, on the day of the birth of Isaac Newton, you could not have really truthfully uttered the sentence, "Today a universal genius was born." But after, I mean, universal genius is a bit of a loaded term, but after Newton published his Principia, or maybe after it had a certain impact, and after it was shown to be accurate, even though it was eventually proved wrong, then you could make the sentence, or you could claim, on the birth date of Newton, a universal genius was born. That's a way of meaning that nobody could have known at that time. That's a legitimate historiographic meaning. But that's not the meaning of the whole of history, because you relate the point that has happened already. Yes. And then finally, these philosophers also believe that there's a form of moral failing in speculative philosophy of history, because at least it has a doubtful relationship, as already said, with forms of historical agency and responsibility. Because if you create what they call fancy entities, like Volksgeist, or perhaps even class struggle up to a certain extent, and certain universalizing ideologies by which you interpret the whole of history, like as a struggle for communism, or as the Parousia, or a historical mission, or right here, destiny of a people, then it is at least unclear that there is any responsibility for your actions, or that historical agency makes a difference. And then, at least in some understanding, that leads you to a simple ends justifies the means logic, given the fixed goal that history is progressing towards anywhere, like communism or anything else. And this criticism was basically raised not so much by the philosophers of history, but by famous people they were building on, like Karl Popper and Isaiah Berlin, which then themselves had their liberal political philosophy. Right. So if I summarize, for those people in the 1950s and 60s, speculative philosophy of history was failed science, or failed historiography at least, because it was epistemologically illicit. It's failed philosophy because it's metaphysically illicit, or just because it is metaphysics, for them at least. And because it's logically illicit, and it's morally illicit, might be the right word, it might be morally doubtful or something, because it has totalitarian tendencies. And I think MC Lemon has summarized that well. He's actually much more sympathetic. He's just summarizing it into speculative philosophy, but it's the quote: "They found it was factually unfounded, impossible to prove, prey to imaginative flights of fancy, and premised on an unrealistically encyclopedic knowledge of history." The last thing was probably not, because it didn't even have knowledge of history. But I think basically, how many time is it? Okay. Yeah. 15, 20 minutes. Okay, maybe more like 20. So basically, I agree on the criticism offered in terms of philosophy. There's a bit of a mistake here, but not on the meta philosophy. I do think that there's an epistemic problem and a logical problem, and up to a certain extent also a metaphysical problem in speculative philosophy of history. But I don't think that the right way to approach it is with a basic analytical philosophy of history account of what historiography is and philosophy of history. I do think that, we'll talk about it now. If we take what philosophy of history tried to do seriously, we should talk instead about social ontology and the scope of historiographic hypothesis or thesis. And of course, there's the social usefulness of speculative philosophy of history that I also talked about before. Right. Well, I'm not going to go into this now very much, because I want to talk a long time, but so the understanding that those people who criticize speculative philosophy had of what philosophy of history, historiography is about, basically it was about the conceptual and logical analysis of language and the logical structure of language, or of science in particular. And by science, they had a one-size-fits-all understanding of science that they derived from the understanding of physics. So it was strongly prescriptive towards historiography. And the idea was to formally reconstruct the language of science as a logical edifice of sentences of increasing generality of scope. You build the observation sentences, and you subsume them under covering laws, and then you have even more general covering laws. That's how science builds. If we take a term from Thomas Kuhn, normal science, how science usually work, and absolute presupposition, that's Collingwood, things you don't question. That was sort of the normal philosophy of the time and the absolute presupposition of them. But I think we should build the philosophy of historiography instead, because now a lot of time has passed, on post-positivist philosophy of science and on also a broad synopsis of perspectives. And those broad synopsis of perspectives, we also have this understanding of the theory of history of different relations to the past. So we can acknowledge speculative philosophy of history as an important way for people to relate to the past, perhaps, while acknowledging too that it's epistemically flawed and has big problems. And I think what the philosophy of historiography basically should do is study the relationship between the evidentiary and theoretical input that comes from historiography, the evidence and the theories that historiography use, and the form of output that we have in historiographic texts. And it might very well be that in this output, a lot of speculative elements turn up, and they should then be also properly acknowledged and properly investigated. And this form of understanding of the philosophy of historiography is basically built on the work of Peter Kossa and Avier Sataka. You might know them, they're pretty famous in the philosophy of historiography. Now, but what do I think should be done instead of speculative philosophy of history or of its topics? Well, I think one of the issues that come out of it is social ontology. I think it's not wrong to ask about the basic constituents of history, or the social sphere at least, not in the sense of the basic driving forces of the historical process, that as well maybe, but that will be then grand scope social hypotheses or theories, but basically about what is the stuff that the social sphere is consisting of and built of. So maybe we can redefine pattern and principle of history in that way. Maybe we can talk about social mechanisms, structures, agents, rules, colligations, wholes, and that sort of stuff. I think that we can meaningfully talk about. And we can meaningfully talk about that because we all live in a social sphere too, and we can sort of deduce this understanding of what society is about also from our own understanding of societies we're living. And I think this is one way of bringing epistemology and ontology, or metaphysically, closer together. Because one of the criticisms of the critique of speculative philosophy of history is always that we cannot not do metaphysics on one level. Louis Mink and Hermann Paul have made this criticism before, but this is always very abstract. It doesn't say much. So I guess talking about social ontology solves that issue up to a certain extent, because we can ask ourselves always, well, if we do epistemology, we have to ask ourselves which kind of entities do we presuppose in our epistemology, and how do they influence what we presuppose? And we can do that via social ontology or via the ontology of historiography. And if we do metaphysics, we have to always make a reasonable claim how we come to know the things that we know, or that we metaphysically sort of presuppose or induce. So I think what social ontology can do is we can have a look at sort of common sense ontology of the working historian. That's one way. So that would be called descriptive metaphysics of the whole enterprise. Or yes, so or maybe even of our historical existence, what it is to be here, think and act historically. But of course, we could also think about it more broadly as a question of substantive historical ontology. Given that, well, I mean, we can look at the working ontology of a historian, but we can also say, well, maybe social ontology is such a developed field, and we all live in certain societies that have certain properties. Maybe we can actually even come to a prescriptive social ontology, which then can be taken over by historians. Whether that could salvage any of the entities postulated by the substantive philosophy of history or by the speculative philosophies of history is a different question. So whether we can make sense via basic social ontology of such notions as nations, classes, civilizations, of a Volksgeist as acting in history is a different question still. And of course, another use of the entities postulate, even maybe those entities, or most of them, is of course we can see them as models and as theoretical presuppositions for researching the past, or what Walsh calls interpretative principles. And then they come very close to my second point, what I think speculative history comes down to. I mean, it is grand scope hypothesis about the social sphere or about the past. We could, on one level, if we discard forms of speculative philosophy of history epistemically from the beginning. So we could say, as I said before, given that they have no proper access to the past, they can't give us sort of they can't give us knowledge of the past. I mean, revelation, faith, introspection, a priori knowledge or dialectical methods are not good ways to know the past. The knowledge of the past is inferential and mostly testimonial. So it's about what other people have said, and then you infer knowledge of it. So on that level, it's epistemically flawed, because we have no introspective, so we have no knowledge of the past as we have knowledge of our own internal minds and state, that I'm hungry or so on. We don't introspect into. We have no a priori knowledge of the past. And if we don't have that, then anything we assert about history as a whole or about large swaths of history must be inferred by the evidence in our theoretical categories that we have. So it must be a hypothesis of about the past on a grand scope. And if you think about it, the patterns and mechanisms that many speculative philosophers of history have postulated, they are maybe grand or maybe grandest scope historical hypotheses, like such a hypothesis like all history is the history of class struggle, or there's a law of the development of the productive forces that eventually leads to communism, or any other of that theories. They properly understood maybe their grand scope and vague theories about history. And then we can sort of epistemically ascertain them. I mean, there are huge semantic issues of that. What is then exactly a class? What are productive forces? And of course, then there's the question of the accuracy by the evidence. But that any sort of historical hypothesis has to face those two. They probably don't fare very well because they're so wide and semantically doubtful and epistemically doubtful. But if we take them as such, then the mechanisms and the pattern that speculative philosophy of history has been postulating, then they're just grand scope theories. Maybe they're programmatic statements about future research programs. They could be seen as theoretical models, either ideal types, maybe trends, or something like basic philosophy, the philosophical concept. That's all interesting stuff that they could be. But then you have to discuss them on a different level. However, what the problem here is, historiography or history is often said to offer token explanations. So it offers explanations of singular things. There was only one Renaissance. There was one time that the heir to the Austrian throne was killed in 1914. There was one First World War, and so forth. So it doesn't really give type kind of social science explanation about sort of certain types of. And it's also not an experimental science, so it can't really test hypotheses of a grand scope by sort of making experiments. So I doubt very much that this very wide, at least very wide scope social theories have any good purchase as empirical thesis. But of course, this is a question that is open for historiography to find out. And because, as I wrote here in the end of the slide, I don't think there are grand scope, accurate theories in historiography that just apply very widely to a lot of phenomena of a grand scope. There are grand scope, accurate theories in some natural sciences like gravity and so forth. But they can be useful as theoretical tools, as I said, as programmatic statements, and then to do your historiographic research. So speculative philosophies of history, because they have no means to decide epistemically between their competing philosophical claims. I don't know. I mean, is the Jewish eschatology any better than the Christian one? I don't know. There's no way to decide that by the evidence. So they are each epistemically equally unfounded. As for the grand scope theories, if we take them as grand scope theories about the past, about aspects of the past, then I think they're at least epistemically underdetermined, or at least they are indeterminate. And often, for speculative philosophy of history, there's no rational way to decide between them. And when it comes to the grand scope theories, they're at least underdetermined. And if we look how the followers of this sort of philosophy work, then we see exactly that there are no rational ways of deciding between them, because what we see of them is a lot of dogmatism. You just assert the truth of your statement without any foundation. There's a lot of confirmation bias. There are different fragmented schools. So if the founder of the school says it one way, then the next generations will all interpret it slightly different. So they will fragment, there are bubbles. And there's a lot of what you could call ad hoceries, a lot of ad hoc redefinitions of the main claims. Then, if all history is the history of class struggle, and then you look at something and you have to redefine class in that situation, maybe the term class doesn't fit very well there. So given this background over speculative philosophy is and its chances of epistemic success, which is slim, many people have suggested they are mainly reflections of the main issues and anxieties of their own time. And that makes them good objects for historiography and for contemporary criticism. Right. Okay, maybe not 10 minutes. Oh, yes, no, it's only 3 slides. We should be good. So now I come to what is speculative philosophy then beyond its in society more generally. Well, I think it's definitely one of the practical relations to the past that people maintain. So, I mean, not everybody is a historian, or not everybody is a philosopher. Not everybody cares about the epistemic justification of what they think. And I'm not trying to talk that down. It's maybe for good reasons. Maybe you can lead a very good life and a very successful life in terms of your own goals. But it's definitely a practical orientation for many people of how to lead their life and how to locate themselves. And it's part of what Hayden White called the practical past, how just people have an understanding of the past in their head and they chart their way in the present into the future. And I will give tomorrow a talk in Maastricht on that topic. It's called the What and Why of Theory of History on these relations to the past thing. And of course, if we look at it historically, speculative philosophy of history has been a traditional way of understanding and relating to the past throughout a lot of human history. It has been named differently, forms of myth, tradition, folklore, epic tales. They all relate sort of the society they are about, in one sense, to the whole of history and to where the society is going. And they are meant to answer, at least, basic questions such as where do we come from, where are we going, what's the meaning of it all. Stenek, Vasicek, I think, I don't know if I pronounce it correctly, it's called sort of perennial meta-narrative. I'm not here committing now to the claim that every society always had it, but maybe a certain understanding or answering of that question is part of many kind of basic stories from Gilgamesh to Hollywood and beyond. So if literature, politics, philosophy, and everyday life is full of speculative philosophy of history, maybe this need for meaning is sort of a constant, some people call it an anthropological constant, but at least a basic way of sense making that deals with the experience of time. And with the experience of time comes, of course, the understanding of change and contingency and choice. And that the people do certain things and it ended up very differently from what they thought. And with that, there comes hindsight in again. So I think speculative philosophy of history arguably has a lot of functions and uses. It is part of the historical process, but not its self-consciousness. I mean, obviously, people do things for reasons, and they do also things for the reasons that speculative philosophy of history give them. It can have a moral function. It has, sorry, I'm naming what functions people say. Some people say it gives satisfaction to people. MC Lemon says it's historicity, which is, of course, a term made out of theodicy and history. So to justify the bad ways people have been treating each other throughout history, as theodicy is the way of justifying why there's evil and when God is there. Others have said it's basically to deal with the problem of evil. It can give comfort, obviously, but it can also be used as excuse and deflect blame. So you can also have sort of negative outcomes, at least for other groups. Some people have even argued certain speculative philosophies of history believe in some form of eternity of the present, and by that way they counsel temporal provincialism. If the past, just like the present, was always the way it is, then the future will also be, so that blocks change. Other people say it's a personal vision rather than a scientific hypothesis, so that's fine too. Maybe people can live by all kinds of personal visions. Whereas somebody like Carnap said, I said about metaphysics in general, it's musicians without musical ability. So basically it's art, but for those who cannot do proper art, they do it. But this is a bit of an unkind way if people have been doing it since time immemorial. And then there's of course the question, what is the effect on something like historiography? I mean, Marxist historiography has been influenced strongly by speculative Marxist philosophy of history, maybe for the better, for good outcomes. So I'm not trying to judge here on all these things. But what is clear is to these questions that speculative philosophy of history asks, scientific historiography and philosophy have no answer. So the meaning of history on that level, what is it all for, what are we going, is not answerable, if not meaningless, if you like, from the perspective of historiography and its philosophy. So you could say that, Mr. Tucker does, that the religiously inclined and the epistemically unconcerned hold these positions for non-epistemic and irrational reasons, or for at least non-rational reasons. So maybe it's impervious to any kind of objection that these philosophers made, or philosophy can make in general, historiography. So this is my conclusion now. Yes. So what I've tried to say here today to all of you is that I believe properly conceived issues raised by speculative philosophy of history turn into question of social ontology and grand scope historical hypothesis and thesis. Something that should be discussed still in the philosophy of historiography is what's the extent of speculative philosophy of history within historiography itself. As I said, some people have argued that sort of issues of axiology, of sort of value judgment, are necessarily connected to speculative philosophy of history. Other people have said that by writing a narrative, by narrativization, there's a speculative moment that comes in automatically. Hayden White is very famous, if you heard of him. But Haskell Fade has made the same point, similar points. And then, of course, Louis Mink has said maybe there's a middle ground of continuities between ordinary history and philosophy of history, which means speculative philosophy of history. And that might very well be the case. That's a question of practical research into historiography. I mean, after all, probably a person like David Christian is a proper historian as well, but there's a strong speculative element to it. And I think we can be liberal about that. It's just my position. There can be as much speculative philosophy of history in any work of historiography, as long as you make it explicit. As long as you make explicit, this is not something that I have knowledge about and inferred by the evidence, but this is my personal vision, or whatever you call it. I know this is something else that I want to communicate to you, and then you can reasonably discuss it. And then, of course, I just said the speculative philosophy of history is in relation to the past that presumably many people hold. So it's a good subject matter for theory of history, that research that's the races to the past that people have. And of course, we can and maybe should ask the normative question here, should people believe in speculative philosophy and history in the way that many people do, or should they not? I have no argument, no answer to that. But as a very last point, of course, I'm making here a value judgment too, or maybe a meta-ethical judgment, that I'm saying that we should only believe in stuff for which we have evidence, which is epistemically licit. But we could also sort of put the shoe on the other foot. We could say, if historiography and philosophy don't give us the meaning of history, maybe so much worse for them. Maybe they should be abandoned instead of speculation. Maybe speculation should be embraced instead. That was obviously not what I was saying here or arguing for, but I think that's a good point to end with. And I'm just saying now, very end, I have a paper on universal history for a handbook, if you're interested in it. There I go more into some speculative philosophers' history in detail. And I hope this, what I'm presented here, is going to be made into a paper too, of that title. So if you're interested in this, please let me know and I'll share the stuff with you. Thank you very much, everyone.
All right. Can the online people hear me, because I'm talking through George's mic? Can you maybe put a thumbs up or something?
Yes, it's perfect.
You can hear me? Okay, great. Otherwise, we're having an echo, which is more difficult. All right. We have like half an hour, plenty of time for questions. So the room the floor is open, so to say. Maybe
first in the room and
yeah,
online.
we'll take some from here first, and then we look online. So maybe
I'll
already type it in the or raise your hands, like there's already someone. All right. We'll start with Cinderella.
Thanks for the presentation. My question is basically the following. I had the idea that one assumption that you didn't talk about, I think it should be part of the story, is ultimately basically what the aim of doing history. I mean, it's made in very simple ways. The simple version of it, it seems that you assume both you and enemy, assume that realism is the objective, right? You have to have the criteria is we have to have an absolutely correct history. It's the criteria that we project something. And I had the impression that you basically that speculative history can play even an absolutely useful role, not in the sense that it helps us to adequately represent reality, but that it creates a climate or tools to then build on for epistemic and kind of more relating it to the facts, something like that. But I was wondering, what do you do kind of anti-realist versions of history, basically saying the goal of the narrative or even of a history in general is not simply just we want to know history for its own sake, but we want to move to other pragmatic reasons. A bit like you ended also like the interested in history. Want to make sense of it, we want to be able to predict the future, we want to do something, or we want to avoid mistakes or something. But that's the ultimate aim. This question, whether speculative history actually is epistemically adequate of how history really has happened, shifts in meaning or something. It's a bit, so that, what I mean about that's weird is when history then seen as, in ways, fictions that help us think about ourselves or present in something rather than being just.
Yes. So I guess that, if I understood correctly, there are two parts of your question. The first is there was the realism and to what extent historiography is built on.
What's the goal of history?
Yeah. What's the goal of history? Exactly. Yes. Realism, I think, is a separate topic. Yes, I mean, for me, the goal of history is, or historiography, is knowledge of the past, yes. And you can give that knowledge, or many people give that knowledge, a realist reading. So then knowledge of the past basically is how the past happened. That is right. And then I guess the next claim is from that that knowledge of, right, that's the question, yes. That knowledge of the past, that's so the question is, does this knowledge of the past enable us better to lead our lives than speculative philosophy of histories would do, right? That is then sort of the meta question to it. Does it allow us to
So what I mean by realism is not either you say we want to know history that really happens, whether it's really not something, or we want to use history for non-epistemic purposes. Like what many of these speculative seems to make sense of our lives.
Yes.
They help us to do that by
Yes. So I guess if we were to go down that route, I would have to show why is knowledge of the past useful or pragmatically useful tool for the lives that people lead, right? And why is it not? why are the templates and the forms of understanding the past and the future and the present of speculative philosophy history, why isn't that at least as good a guide to lead your life as historiography is? I don't have a good answer to that. I think one can be liberal on that, in the sense of that for different spheres of society and different kind of situations, we can rely on different guiding principles or forces. I mean, just a rather traditional take. I think in a lot of politics or conflictual situations, I think knowledge of the past is the best guide that we might have to navigate those. Whether knowledge of the past is the best guide to navigate if a loved one of anybody has died or something, that probably won't be it. Then you might go to speculative philosophy of history and it might give you what you want. Yes, but I guess the underpinning, whatever you call it, argument that I have here obviously is, or maybe it's not obviously, is that knowledge of the past is good for us and that we should avail ourselves of it as much as we can. Maybe not in every kind of life decision, but if we want to live a rational life, I guess that is part of it. Yes.
Yeah, that's basically my.
Yeah.
Great paper, especially.
Yeah. You could call that a value judgment as well, actually. It's like a meta value judgment or whatever it is.
All right, we have 2 more questions here, and then we might turn to the online. So there was a question. I think you raised your hand. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I trying to articulate my question to the very end, and then you said something that maybe helps me do that. So toward the very end of the book is that you kind of sketch the distinction between knowledge of the historian as supported by evidence and what you call personal views. And in a way, I think this distinction is too, and I wonder whether trying to make it more fine-grained another level, how speculative philosophy enters. Broadly speaking, I would align with people like Hempel and say a certain degree of speculative or substantial philosophization of history is unavoidable for the very reason that we can generalize, interpret contested concepts, and so on and so forth. More precisely, there is a level in which this is very true of the sort of regulative principles or methodological principles that historians follow, right? So, for instance, to go back to one of your examples, if you ask a Marxist historian whether all history is a history of the class struggle, certainly, if they are let's say, prudent, they will not say yes, of course, or no, not at all. They would not say either, oh, that's just a matter of personal view, so it's something that falls in between something like personal vision and something like knowledge as supported by the fact. It's more of a sort of methodological regulative principle that allows them to inspire in a certain direction, to try and understand the past in a certain way, or maybe interpret the past in a certain way, because they think it's productive to do so, right? And so this sort of general interpretive principle that beside over the inquiries of chemistry is something that I'll say falls within the scope of speculative philosophy. My question is
yeah, it's a good question. I didn't want to make it look like as if there was, on the one hand, knowledge of the past only, and the other thing was only a personal view. That is, I agree with you, that's too coarse-grained, because we do have, there are statements about the past and understandings of the past that are not, I mean, depending on how you define knowledge of the past, that are not knowledge of the past, as I would understand it, but that are still not just a subjective personal view of somebody. They are sort of what the philosophy of science called epistemically underdetermined, but not strongly underdetermined. So it says, or you have two competing theses, and there you have sort of leeway in between or something, or then you can sort of broaden the evidence base or something, or by some other means, eventually you might find one that is then properly justified, or you might never do that. I mean, there are a lot of propositions about the past, given that we depend on evidence which comes to us in a sort of unregulated process that we will never know about, or very rarely know about. And the other was about, did you call it methodological principles and regulative principles? I mean, I think I tried to say that perhaps. I have nothing against if we turn certain basic, how you will call it, principle or tenets of speculative philosophy of history into some kind of theoretical guidance or something. Yeah, that's part of me still. I mean, maybe you're right. There's not then large scope theory might be, but not a hypothesis. But I'm a bit doubtful what work they then do in the actual historian, because if I see how this grand scope or whatever they are, methodological, I'm sure it's a methodological or these kind of theoretical presuppositions or principles, like about what class is, maybe not all classes or history is class struggle, that when they are applied to the actual explanandum, the actual work of the historian, then they are by necessity being fragmented, or they're by necessity being taken back. They're by necessity sort of they sort of then come. You can then either save the grand theory by adding ad hoc stipulation or just redefining your concepts, or you come up with a much more limited hypothesis or theory, which then fits your evidence much better. So I can live with that. It gives a general regulative principle, but I wouldn't then call it speculative anymore. We'll just make it part of the theoretical apparatus or theoretical of certain historians. But then when you try to explain the past of them, I would be very hesitant to say that they do any work. Whatever, I think they usually fragment them to sort of, because historiography mainly offers token explanation of certain things, and I don't think we have very well established and epistemically established grand scope theories about history. The question is why we can't have that. And that might be because it's an open system and it's very complex and it's not. But it's a different question. I'm not sure if it answers your questions, but
thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for leading anything and very rich of the first one relates to how you portray the three domains where speculative history might be useful in the art. The making of daily lives and this sense making is and you said for historiography, it could also be this mirror where we can see the qualities of different commitments and anxieties of people at a different time point, that perhaps is also following up these interpretative principles. And then the third domain, you mentioned the philosophy of scientific historiography in itself, being able to account for different levels of meaning or scope of historical explanation. And this is kind of where you see it used. So my question is, do you see some connection between these two domains, or do you rather see that we should rather fragment the philosophy of history and say it might be useful here for everyday life in this sense, might be useful for historiography in this sense, and it might be useful for the philosophy of scientific historiography in this sense, or do you see a connection between these three domains and how the philosophy history pans out?
well,
this is the first one.
Oh, sorry. Oh, maybe, yeah. Yes, I'm not sure if I'm at the height of my ability still, but so I guess this first question comes back to the point whether or not we need this very, very basic sense-making categories, entities, guidances in our lives as people, because I don't know. I never feel very compelled by them, but maybe I hold some of them myself, and I shouldn't generalize too far from what I do understand that many people do, you know. So I guess if there was a connecting thread between all of them, then it would be because there's something in the way humans make sense of, I don't know, temporality, the change of time, or whatever it is, that thrust that onto us. And there are good thinkers who might have argued something like that. I mean, not particularly, but there's, for instance, there's Jörn Rüsen, German historian of theorist of history, which sort of made this argument. He has this very, very broad endeavor. He wants to try to analyze historical thinking in general, what it is and how it works. And one part for and narrative and so on. One part of it is it's sense making, but since historiography, it also has this epistemic part to it and so forth. But it's all overall in the service of sense making and making historical sense. So that would be and if you can just shortly correct us too strong, but say something that I think I made the argument sort of not necessarily that speculative philosophy is useful in historiography as grand scope thinking. I think its issues can be turned into grand scope view and the social ontology. I don't think as it stands, it's useful. So you have to sort of make it, because then they become epistemically adjudicable, and you don't have problems with the future, and you don't make other. So it hinges on that. Did you have another question?
Yeah. Yes. So the second one relates to the anti-metaphysical critique and its current direction, right? This distinction between philosophy of science and philosophy of nature, right now, in analytic philosophy of science, it is coming back. Okay. At least within certain philosophies of special sciences like biology. There are philosophers really interested in trying to demonstrate, on the one hand, between philosophy of science proper and philosophy of nature, but also trying to understand the interanimation of philosophy, reinforcements. Right? So one of the lines of arguments that contemporary philosophers say is that, well, we can never get rid of philosophy of nature because it is embedded within any philosophy of science. We as philosophers at the time might try to, where we call balance and all that are useful of science with themselves, or we can never get rid of these sort of underlying philosophical limits. So I'm wondering if, even though we might critique there will always be a sense in which even within the philosophy of scientific historiography, it will be quite boundary. I think that perhaps what we should do is explain that and try to navigate as possible the domain, but there might be a sense where we be able to get rid of it entirely.
Yes, but can I ask you then, are they coming back as philosophy of nature, or as via the philosophy of the special disciplines, or the sort of as philosophical metadisciplinary endeavor, so via the philosophy of biology or via the philosophy of this and that? Because then, if they will only be speculative philosophy of history in that understanding that I was pursuing, if they were doing philosophy of nature not attached to the sciences, not via the science. So if you sort of were coming up what nature is by speculating about it without epistemic access to a lot of things. So on that level, I mean, I'm not, this is a bit of a loaded term too, but even in the 1960s already, Arthur Danto has said that if you do analytic philosophy of history properly, you end up with a descriptive metaphysics, and that's a term from Strawson originally, descriptive metaphysics of historical existence. So he didn't even want to talk about the descriptive metaphysics of historiography alone, because historians postulate all kinds of entities. What is the Renaissance? It's not easy to say, it's not something, there's a Renaissance here. I look at it. It's really not easy to say whether it exists, and that a difficult question is. But he goes even further, because he says, given the temporal language that we use in historiography, particularly too, with hindsight, but also generally, there's something like a metaphysics layered into that language, and we can't do without that. Yes, so I guess the question is not then so much whether or not you do metaphysics. The question is, how do you start doing it? Do you start doing it via the sciences, or do you start doing it without the sciences? And you can still do it without the sciences, and you can still have a meaningful life, I guess. And yeah, I'm not. I mean, I'm not trying to adjudicate here that people should abolish their thinking on that level. That would be too strong. But I'm just thinking that it cannot have a place in historiography because it's epistemically illicit for this and this reasons. Yes.
Okay, let's maybe first go to Naif online. He's been waiting for a long time.
Yes, sorry.
We can do a different round in the room if there's more questions. But Naif, all yours if you can hear us.
Thank you so much. First off, thank you for the amazing talk. I've been waiting, to be honest, to see someone revive talks on speculative philosophy of history for the past couple of years since I got into this field. So overall, I would say I think the talk reflects the complexity of the topic. Overall, I think from your lecture, we can see how complex this topic is and how gruesome and tiring lecturing within an hour explaining speculative philosophy of history as a whole is quite tiring. And again, it's a topic that has been buried for too long. And I think this reflects the complexities. I don't necessarily have a question, but maybe a couple of points I could give to make sense of speculative philosophy of history, considering the complexity of the topics, the questions overall, and the talk. So in my recent research in big history and speculative philosophy of history, I think I'll mention a couple of points that I've noticed. One thing is the multidisciplinary nature of speculative philosophy of history as a whole that we see within all speculative philosophers of history. It's always multidisciplinary. And there's a rejection and critique of over-specialization. You see this with David Christian, you see this with Spengler, Toynbee, and Quigley. So you see this a critique of over-specialization in departments themselves and between different departments. So you see this element within most speculative philosophers of history. Another thing is the necessity of speculation also within, and hence the name, of course. And finally, you have the fact that all speculative philosophers of history believe that they are pursuing a more superior form of history than normal or ordinary historians. That's one thing. These are specific points I think we should always keep in mind when looking at speculative philosophy of history. But I think more importantly, however, on my current research, I noticed something of what I term as interdisciplinary adaptability of this specific field, that it moves between different departments and so on, and it stayed alive, even though it's been buried by the critical and analytical philosophy of history and so on and so forth, be it by the separation of the fields and calling them speculative by Walsh, for instance, and so on, or for other reasons. So I think, and Rolf Brunner, I think, points this out perfectly, and as you've mentioned as well in the talk, is that everyone has an explicit, if not explicit, or an implicit speculative philosophy of history in a sense. And this is because it's a basic human concern. And even David Christian, who provides, I mean, you named him as a speculative philosopher of history here, which is quite interesting. But he also, I mean, he's different. He provides a different form of speculation here than Spengler and Toynbee. But even he agrees that, in a sense, we require, in a sense, a form of speculation onto the future, in a sense. But I think what I would say is, I think why this is important, I believe, to realize that it's a basic human concern. If you look at, for instance, the global split currently between Russia and the West concerning the war in Ukraine, it reflects the weaponization of two types of speculative philosophies of history that you've mentioned. So the linear and progressive liberal philosophy of history, you see this with Slavoj Žižek, for instance, versus the cyclical and regressive philosophy of history by Dugin, for instance. And ironically, both were named the most dangerous philosophers in the world at one point in the time. So here we see the relevance again of, I think, Hayden White's argument that each specific philosophy of history has social and political implications as well. So there's so many different questions I think we have, because it's, I think, a field that has been buried for so long. And I think now that there are questions that are being revived, we're going to have too many questions, again, and too many things to discover concerning this specific field. But yeah, I would be grateful if you have any comments, if you're not exhausted already. But thank you again for your time.
No, this was all very interesting, but I think your last point is very well taken, obviously, that, I mean, whatever other reasons there are, but that wars are waged over these belief systems, neutrally put, is a point well taken and well thought of. I mean, it reminded me too, Putin had this pseudo-historical tract before the Ukraine war on the historical unity between the Ukrainian and the Russian people. And that you could also, but this, and maybe the speculative philosophies of Putin and his enemies can be very well analyzed with the tools of modern philosophy of historiography, or with the tools of epistemology. And in the case of Putin and his pseudo-historical tract, which was probably written by somebody else, but published under his name, he speaks about that, I don't know, from the 10th century on, there was a unity between the Ukraine and the Russian people, and the enemy is always from the outside. This typical the typical story of the nationalist is it's always coming from outside, and you're only defending yourself. But if you have the critical tools of epistemology, you can ask yourself how does Putin or whoever wrote that know what 10th century peasants thought? And if you add then the historical knowledge that the nation is mostly a creation of the 18th and 19th century, then it's very unlikely that they had a national consciousness all the time. And anyway, even if they had, we don't have the evidence. So you can very well criticize those sort of speculative philosophies of history with the tools of epistemology and philosophy of historiography. The not so ideal or sad point is people don't change their thinking due to that criticism, and you cannot avoid a war, it would seem. So there are limits to rationality at that level. You can tell Putin anybody that it's fundamentally irrational what they assert about the past, but there's a German proverb which says you can't buy a flower pot for it. That's exactly like this. You can't do much with it. So, and maybe that's one more point, that if speculative philosophies of history are here to stay, and they're sort of an anthropological constant, then the question would at least be how you can make people believe the more benign ones, I suppose, than those that lash out so aggressively, as many of them have done. I mean, the Nazis had a speculative philosophy of history too, based on the race mythology and so forth, and their mission in history and so forth. I mean, these are very vicious versions, and I guess in this room, most of Christian versions, or somewhere or two, are not there. There are Christian other versions of it, or all religions that are not so vicious, but that animate people to do very caritative and kind things. So I don't know. Yeah. Yes.
Is there more questions from the room? There's one. Yeah.
So I typically that the most rational variant of the history is regarding this principles of what history is. Is that itself useful?
Yeah. Well, the idea is not to stay on principle, that there are no overarching principles, which then, of course, you can get into this kind of self-referential and contradictory loop that we all know. The idea is, and I've kept that open, I believe, for whatever reason, most large-scale social scientific or historical theories don't hold up if they are theories of the kind of all history, the history of class struggle, or something more limited. But that doesn't necessarily, I mean, but it's still to an extent an evidentiary and empirical question whether or not there are certain principles that can be asserted throughout certain forms of history, maybe not for prehistory, but in civilization, or for certain forms of. This is not. I'm not against that. So I'm not sure if it's a self-contradictory or a sort of a self-referential paradox. Is that a good answer for you, or is that? Yes. Maybe I commit still to a paradox that you can. I'll be happily shown that I do, but I hope I'm not.
Yeah, this question about mostly special I mean, it seems to me that we are circling around the same issue of how do we actually define kind of philosophical subdisciplinary called speculative history in order to avoid the obvious points that there is always something implicitly philosophical in the way we talk about history. Right? So I was wondering whether maybe in your expanded version of the paper, it would be worthwhile strengthening this sort of double layer. On the one hand, there is speculative philosophy history can be defined as a specific way of trying to answer these questions that are always around. And then your answer to him becomes a special relevance. It's not the way that goes through the special disciplines or the special sciences, but rather it's a sort of post-Hegelian way of trying to tackle these general problems per se. And then the other layer would be the subject matter itself, like the fact that we tend to offer generalizations or interpretations of concepts such as human action or principles of this and so on. I don't know. My feeling is that it would be
So you are saying that in the basic concepts such as pattern or similar, there's a layer of speculation in there that cannot be avoided. Is that the?
There is some level of there is some, let's say, some of these issues are unavoidable, at least at the implicit level, and my first question was also related to that. And so that would be one way to say, oh, we are dealing with things like speculative. But the other level, which I think is more relevant to this topic, there is a specific way of trying to answer this problem, so to articulate these issues. That to me, the way of framing it is very, let's say, in the way to a certain kind of Hegelian understanding of history, like a way of doing speculative global history that brackets issues related to the special topic.
So you're urging me to differentiate speculative philosophy of history per se from the necessary speculation within historiography.
Yeah.
And yes. And in my last slide, I think I had it. There's the Code of Mink where he says, is there a middle ground? Does every work of historiography have that? I mean, Hayden White said something similar. You cannot have a book of historiography. No book of historiography is no philosophy of history, and he meant with that often speculative. But for him, there's nearly no evidential constraints, so I'm not very happy with that. And he says a lot of things, a lot of contradictory things. Well, but there are these arguments, yes. So that's some way of doing it. Yes, no, I'm open to that. I'm not. I didn't want to give the impression that all of historiography is sort of proper inferences by the evidence to something, and then everything that is in a history book from the first sentence to the last word is basically coming out of the evidence by some sort of, I don't know, Bayesian computing or something that historians might do or something. I mean, that I'm not saying, and of course there's a lot of questions in terms of axiology in historiography as well, sort of value judgments and which are in there, which are also not necessarily epistemically adjudicable. And there's a lot of values which people use, which historians use to what they find significant, what they research about, and how they describe it. That's all good. That's all part of philosophy of historiography. I have this sort of evidentialist account, which sort of also wants to find the limits of the evidence of how far does the evidence get us, and everything else, I think, can be a proper part of historiography, but then make it explicit. I don't mind the ideology, but I mind the ideology if I get it in between the lines, sort of draped into some kind of knowledge account or something. Okay, some people cannot be divided, but it's okay. But I'd be happy if people make it as explicit as they can. There, speculative and all other elements. Yes.
Okay. We're almost out of time, but if there's a question burning on somebody's tongue, we can take one more and then, or we wrap up here. Maybe there's more questions online that we didn't look at. No. Otherwise, we can also stop here and thank you.
Yes, I thought
again for this interesting discussion and talk.
I'd like to thank you.
Thank you very much.
Online and offline too. Thank you, everyone.